Our second speaker is Yuki Schwartz, an assistant professor of constructive and political theologies and the associate dean, she's an administrator, okay, of academics and assessment at the Claremont School of Theology. Areas of scholarship include deimperial and decolonial studies, Asian and Asian American theology, political theology, and critical race, gender, and sexuality studies. Yuki's current research investigates the intersections of affect, politics, and U.S. imperialism in Asia during the Cold War and its afterlife. Yuki's paper is titled Messianic Transformation, the Political Shame of the Coming Community.
I am afraid I have no slides for you, so I will try to be engaging with my voice and presentation. In this paper, I will attempt to explicate Italian political theologian Giorgio Agamben's understanding of shame and its relationship to messianic inoperativity, and consider its theological implications in beginning conversation with process theology's concept of creative transformation. Now, creative transformation is a much more positive, progressive, and Christological understanding of salvation than Agamben's very nihilistic conception of messianism. However, I am hopeful that this lens helps me construct an understanding of shame and its possibilities and impossibilities that will be useful for communities in working toward creating ethics of practice focused on love, care, and solidarity, encompassed in this ambivalent understanding of new and different ways of being together. I begin with Agamben's essay, The Idea of Shame, in which Agamben proposes the idea of shame arrives in Western European thought through a scene in the Parmenides where Socrates' encounter with squalor reminds him that filth, waste, and dust are fundamental parts of human life, both material and metaphysical. Agamben encapsulates shame not just as embarrassment or humiliation, but as the inability for human beings to fully and truly understand themselves, either so that they can live up to their potential or know themselves amidst the muck of life. To confront this truth about ourselves means confronting our own essential contingency, our lack, our inability, quote, to take our mortal measure more fully, a shame at not truly understanding ourselves, end quote. It is here where Agamben sets down a version of his vision of shame that will make up his argument later in his book, Remnants of Auschwitz, quote, shame is the index of the unheard of, the frightening proximity of man with himself, end quote. It is not, in typical understandings of shame, it is not the experience of inappropriate being or otherness, but it is the experience of being itself. Agamben turns to Kafka to ruminate on the need, quote, not to liberate oneself from shame, but to liberate shame. It is what Joseph K. strives to achieve during the entire period of his trial, and it is to save his own shame, not his innocence, that at the end he obstinately bows to the headman's knife. It seems to him, we read at the moment of his death, that his shame would survive him, end quote. Thus, Agamben posits a shame that through submission to it unveils relationships, actions, or values that go beyond the individual self. A shame that would survive the individual, that is not the image or idealization of humanity common to philosophy or literature, but centered on an ambivalent creature who in encountering and submitting to shame, challenges accepted wisdoms about what it means to be human. This ambivalence is at the heart of Agamben's ongoing and overall philosophical project, investigating the constitution and limits of language, law, authority, and sovereignty. In his book, Homo Sacer, Agamben asks the question about what life is and how that life is taken up within the biopolitical machine of modern democratic systems, and he unearths two concepts from Greek philosophy and law: bios, which is political life that takes place within the city, and zoe, natural life that is not related to politics. According to Agamben, modern politics is not constituted around the inclusion of zoe, or natural life, within the city or within our political lives, but rather modern politics is focused on this zone that separates the natural and the political life, turning them into bare life. Biopolitics uses bare life in order to define its sovereign power and cannot separate itself from bare life. The historical figure who most prominently represents bare life in Agamben's thought is the homo sacer, literally the sacred man, whose life is not protected by the law, so that anyone who kills him is not committing a homicide, and yet this death of the sacred man is not considered a sacrifice. Just as sovereigns enact authority through killing their subjects without penalty, their subjects can enact their own power and authority by killing the homo sacer. In the modern construction of biopolitics, sovereignty is enacted through bare life, in which the sovereign leaves some life abandoned within these zones of indistinction, where the law no longer operates but still exists, and in doing so, and in existing, defines the law itself. A concept fundamentally related to bare life and homo sacer is the state of exception, in which the sovereign suspends their authority, and yet their authority is still defined by that suspension. The historical site in which this state of exception is most apparent is that of the camp, in which in homo sacer and in remnants of Auschwitz are the literal physical death camps operated by the Nazi regime, although versions of this camp exist and have existed in the United States and around the world. These camps exemplify sovereign power and bare life because they exist only as the result of the state of exception, where law and lawlessness, human and inhuman, combine so that there is no difference between them, and which legally exist because the law was suspended in order to allow them to exist. It is in this zone of indistinction where Agamben finds shame, depicted through the unexpected pink flush on the cheeks of a student whose murder by the SS is reported in survivor testimony. Agamben wonders why this blush, this flush, quote, like a mute apostrophe flying through time to reach us, to bear witness to him, end quote. Here Agamben takes up his reflection from his essay, The Idea of Shame, that shame will survive this young student, as well as Robert Antelme, the witness who saw this shameful blush. Drawing from the psychoanalytic work of Emmanuel Levinas, Agamben links the blush to Levinas's theory that shame is the exposure of the self to the self without escape. Agamben writes, quote, "To be ashamed means to be consigned to something that cannot be assumed. But what cannot be assumed is not something external. Rather, it originates in its own intimacy. It is what is most intimate in us, for example, our own physiological life. Here, the I is thus overcome by its own passivity, its own most sensibility, yet this expropriation and desubjectification is also an extreme and irreducible presence of the I to itself. It is as if our consciousness collapsed and seeking to flee in all directions was simultaneously expropriated by an irrefutable order to be present at its own defacement, at the expropriation of what is most its own. In shame, the subject has no other content than its own desubjectification. It becomes witness to its own disorder, its own oblivion as a subject. This double movement, which is both subjectification and desubjectification, is shame. In encountering this double movement of both subjectification and desubjectification in shame, the subject encounters the zone of indistinction, in which exists the subject's multiple potentialities and impotentialities, to have agency and to be under the rule of another, quote, to be subjected and to be sovereign, end quote. There is also another meaning for the word subject that Agamben intertwines into his explanation: the unsayability and the instability of the pronoun I as the referent to the subject, both of which point back to shame's way of closing down communication and disrupting certainties about identity and self. Figures and remnants of Auschwitz who represent this incommunicability of the I and the subject include camp inmates who mentally and emotionally disconnected from the world and those they shared that world with, becoming both objects of shame and disgust to their fellow inmates, and demonstrating a further zone of indistinction in the camps, where the human and the inhuman among the inmates who were already made bare life to Nazi regime found another way of distinguishing between human and inhuman, or finding an indistinction between human and inhuman. Agamben takes this experience of incomprehensible inmates to argue that the incommunicability they demonstrate is a product of language itself, existing not just for them, but present at all times for any one of us. That is, if one becomes a subject through speech, the paradox is that through speaking, the subject cannot fully assume the signification of the pronoun I, an experience that ends in desubjectification. A gap exists between the I and the speaker, revealing the impossibility of bearing witness to what is around them, to the death camps. This impossibility of bearing witness is due to the gap that exists between the survivor, who is able to bear witness to what they have undergone, and the dead, who are fully immersed in the totality of the camps, but cannot testify through speech to that experience. In the same way as the pronoun I cannot fully encompass the subject, so too the surviving witness cannot fully speak to what has happened in the camps. In survivor testimony, Agamben writes, the subject discovers the impossibility of speaking in the same way that the subject encounters desubjectification. It is in embracing this impossibility of both speech and subject where shame fits into Agamben's messianic conception of what he calls the coming community. The coming of this political community does not lie in the future sense of the word coming, but in this moment when community is arriving at all times into the now. The community is not one that will come about as a result of the machinations of, or acts of individuals who make it up, or even as a result of the types of individuals who make it up, but it is a community that is always in the process of coming, always shifting and living within its potentiality as well as its impotentiality through the choices, actions, or decisions that the community makes and does not make, and acts and does not enact. According to Carlos Salzani, quote, the coming of the coming community is thus an always coming, and its politics finds its place neither in the romanticism of the past nor in the yearning for a utopian future, but rather in a messianic presentness, in the realization that within the present lies the possibility of change and transformation, end quote. Shame plays a role in this coming because it creates an ever-present attunement to this possibility and impossibility, creating interruptions so that reflection and reorientation about identity, community, values, and affiliations can take place. This newness and openness associated with the coming community, associated with shame, connects also to Agamben's concept of messianism, which arises most profoundly at the end of his book, Remnants of Auschwitz, where he describes shame as a messianic power, and then continues in his following text, The Time That Remains, where he examines the Apostle Paul's messianism in depth. Rather than proposing a messianism that points toward a singular or universal oneness of perfection, of humanity that is now one in God, Agamben instead proposes that in the messianic time of the now, where differences between creatures continue to divide to the point where they are impossible and irrelevant, messianic power works by rendering structures and concepts impossible so that they cannot work as they are traditionally conceived, but also frees them so that they can be imagined for new and multiple possibilities. Shame participates in this impossibility of the messianic now, in that it can prompt a visceral and immediate interruption in participation with time, with the world, and the structures that seek to control both. Shame can stop the operation of theological unworldly powers so that those who are caught in those powers come to know their unknowability. But in that unknowability, there is the possibility for the new, the different, the strange and uncanny, or the glorious and amazing. While shame has been captured by theological and secular orders who use its powers to fuel their own projects, Agamben hints that shame may be a way toward the messianic time of the now. Shame is the experience of what cannot be endured, comprehended, or assumed, countering a traditional association that salvation has with the perfect. Shame instead directs the subject toward the possibilities of newness that is always coming now. This last section of my paper is still very much a work in progress, but one that I am interested in and excited about developing further as I am exploring this depiction of messianic shame and the coming community alongside the concept of creative transformation, specifically the model that Monica Coleman presents as part of her postmodern womanist theology, Making a Way Out of No Way. Coleman draws upon John Cobb's description of creative transformation as a part of the work of God's salvation that is located in newness and novelty that takes place through the process of change that is typically associated with Christ. However, Coleman adapts this concept of creative transformation, reading it in conversation with womanist theology and recognition of the contextual, communal, and creative coming and becoming that occurs in these communities and contexts that do not solely or necessarily relate to salvation in Christic terms. Creative transformation also disrupts imperial Christendom's emphasis on a stable or originary beingness for humans, for creations, or the divine, instead focusing on the change and novelty or newness or nowness associated with the constant process of becoming. That is, the desubjectification at the heart of messianic shame is not the nothing or the unspeakable, is not unspeakable because it is nothing or it is the utter passivity of nihilism, but rather it is caught up in the incompleteness and instability of changingness. It is, as John Cobb and David Ray Griffin write, quote, the transformation of elements through the introduction of novelty. It alters their nature and meaning without suppressing or destroying that, end quote. That which is past or considered originary or essential is not lost, but neither is it idolized, as creative transformation does not give authority to the structures, systems, or institutions that make up the world that is now, but calls attention to the possibilities and also the impossibilities that come with change. Again, Cobb's interpretation of change is a much more hopeful and positive one than Agamben, as he argues that the new is unrealized potentiality for transforming the world without destroying it. But it is not completely unlike the image Agamben provides for his understanding of shame and its role in the messianic. To bear witness to shame is to participate in profanation. To bear witness to shame is to participate in profanation, an act of destabilizing and rendering unusable the certainties and the structures that rely on categorical binaries, such as human and unhuman, sacred and profane, shameful and glorious, in ways that shore up authorities' structures of power. What is declared sacred becomes untouchable and also unchangeable, but profanation, quote, means to return to common use that which has been removed to the sphere of the sacred. To profane means not to simply abolish or erase separations, but to learn to put things to new use and to play with them. Or as Cobb writes, quote, the new builds upon the old and transfuses it with meaning it could not have apart from the new. The new not only frees us from the old, but it frees us for it. It establishes the world as it transforms it. One of the adaptations that Coleman makes with her theology in regard to Cobb's description of creative transformation and its focus on Christ, she argues for the need to emphasize the creative power of transformation rather than the specific experience of Christ, especially in Christ's typical association with Jesus. The creative participates in the profane work of attending to what is always coming, and to be surprised and amazed in this encounter with what the creating and being creative, what is coming and becoming is showing us. Coleman also emphasizes that creative transformation, in addition to challenging the violent status quo that threatens life in different contexts, is a work of creaturely agency in partnership with divine agency that takes place in contexts of community. That is, salvation as understood through creative transformation does not come from an individual figure who comes from outside the community, but in practice that take place within communities whose practices widen the participation in life beyond past understandings. This is a perspective that I hope to explore regarding Messianic shame. By turning to shame as a participant in creative transformation, I think there may be a chance to recognize the unknowability and impossibility to fully know ourselves and others, but also to find ways to accept and love ourselves and others anyway, in whatever form we come, and also to learn how to be amazed and surprised by it and delight in love. There can be in shame the impotentiality for new possibilities, new opportunities for identities and world, based not in violence but in love. By bearing witness to our shame and in shame, with all our impossibilities and possibilities, there can be a breath of space to pause to decide where to direct our attention in love, and also a chance to stop and rest in love itself, in creative amazement and wonder at what is always being created in relationships that are coming and becoming. Thank you.